A man with a gun pressed against a school nurse's ribs is not supposed to look confused. But the man holding Emily Foster at gunpoint in the front office of Iron Ridge Military Academy looked exactly that, confused and getting more unsettled by the second. Because Emily hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried, she hadn't even flinched. She just stood there with her hands slightly raised, studying him the way a person studies a map when they already know the terrain. He'd grabbed the wrong woman. He just didn't know it yet. If you've made it this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story gets a lot bigger than one room, one gun, and one nurse nobody thought to take seriously. If this story moves you, hit follow, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this reaches. The morning had started the way most Tuesdays did at Iron Ridge. Gray sky, wind cutting down off the mountains, cadets marching in formation across the quad, while the rest of the staff drank bad coffee and pretended to be awake. Iron Ridge Military Academy sat 8 miles outside Blackstone, Montana, and it carried itself like the town did, proud, sparse, and not particularly interested in impressing anyone. The buildings were old brick and older stone. The flagpole out front needed repainting. The heating system in the east wing had been broken since October, and nobody expected it to be fixed before April. Emily Foster had been the school nurse for 2 years and 4 months. She knew this because she'd started counting, not out of misery exactly, but out of habit. She counted things. Miles. Medications. Exits. It was the kind of attention to detail that made her very good at her job and only mildly irritating to the people around her. She was 31. She had dark circles she didn't bother covering, kept her brown hair pulled back in a knot so old it had started to shape itself, and wore the kind of expression people interpreted as unfriendly before they got to know her. Most people at Iron Ridge hadn't gotten to know her. They tried in the beginning, the usual hallway pleasantries, the staff potlucks she showed up to, and then stood near the door for 40 minutes before quietly leaving. After a while, they stopped trying, and Emily let them. It was easier. Her clinic was a small room off the main administrative hallway, between the assistant principal's office and a storage closet full of broken projectors. It smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. She had a cot, 2 chairs, a supply cabinet she kept locked, and a mini fridge she never let anyone near. On the wall above her desk, she'd tacked a laminated evacuation map, not because the school required it, but because she'd added her own notations in red marker. Routes? Bottlenecks? Which exit got congested during which class period? Nobody had ever asked about the map. By 8:47 a.m. on that Tuesday, Emily had already treated a sophomore with a migraine, sent a 9th grade cadet home with a temperature of 101.4, and refilled the communal ibuprofen bin that the senior staff went through at a genuinely alarming rate. She was updating intake logs when she heard the front doors. Not a knock, not the regular hydraulic hiss of the entrance. Something heavier. Something that pushed through the resistance too fast. She set her pen down. The man came around the corner before anyone at the front desk had time to react. Mid-40s, wearing a gray jacket that hadn't been washed in a while. Eyes moving too fast, the specific kind of fast that wasn't anger but panic wearing anger's clothes. He had maybe 2 days of stubble and the look of someone who hadn't slept more than a few hours in longer than that. His right hand was in his jacket pocket and he wasn't pulling it out. He grabbed Emily because she was the first person he saw in the hallway. She felt the barrel through the fabric of his pocket. Small frame, probably a 9mm, carried loose, which told her it didn't have a round chambered yet. She registered all of this in roughly 3 seconds. She raised her hands to a height that looked compliant without being theatrical. "Okay," she said. Not "please don't," not "what do you want," not the intake of breath that preceded panic. Just, "okay." He shoved her toward the front office. The receptionist, a woman named Sandra who was 52 and had the loudest laugh in the building, had already pushed back from her desk, hands up, phone knocked to the floor. The assistant principal, Douglas Hale, was standing in his doorway with his mouth open and no words coming out of it. "Everyone stay where you are," the man said. His voice was rough, cracking at the edges. "I just need to talk to somebody. I need to talk to someone about my son." "His name," Hale managed. "What's your son's name?" "Garrett. Garrett Mace. He's a junior." The man's grip tightened on Emily's arm. They said he got expelled. 3 days ago, they sent me a letter saying he got expelled, and I want to know why. I want to talk to somebody who can tell me why, and nobody will call me back. Mr. Mace, Hale said, we can absolutely discuss Garrett. You haven't been discussing anything. I've left 6 messages. 6. His voice broke on the number. I drove 9 hours. 9 hours to find out why my kid got thrown out of the only place he ever told me he was proud to be. Emily stood very still. She was watching his breathing. The grip on her arm was tight but not crushing, the hand of someone holding on rather than threatening. His jacket was damp at the collar despite the cold. He was sweating, heart rate elevated. The gun hand hadn't moved. He wasn't a man who came here to hurt anyone. He was a man who'd run out of other options and made a terrible decision in a parking lot somewhere on the drive up, and now he was stuck with it. She understood the feeling, actually. Mr. Mace, she said. He looked at her. He seemed almost startled, like he'd forgotten she was there. The hallway's not a good place for this, she said. We should go somewhere we can actually talk. I'm the one with the... I know, she said, not dismissively, just acknowledging the fact without making it the center of the conversation. And I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying Douglas's office is 20 feet away. It has chairs, and if you want someone to actually listen to what happened to Garrett, you need to be in a room where people aren't standing in the doorways. Hale was staring at her. Sandra had her hand pressed to her mouth. Nobody had expected the school nurse to start talking. Close the blinds, the man said. If we go in there, you close the blinds. Sure, Emily said. They went into Hale's office. Hale went with them because he didn't have a better option. Emily pulled the door most of the way shut, reached back and rotated the blind rod until the window facing the hallway went opaque, then turned to face the room. The man, Mace, she was using his name in her head now, had let go of her arm. He was standing near the bookshelf, the hand still in the pocket, but the body language had shifted fractionally. He wasn't advancing. He was waiting to see what happened next. He was looking at her. You think I'm scared? She said. Quiet. Not challenging. I've walked out of worse. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, mostly. She pulled one of the chairs away from Hale's desk and set it where it was accessible without being in anyone's path, then sat in the other one. Just sat down, like they were waiting for a bus. Tell me about Garrett, she said. Nut. Within 10 minutes, Iron Ridge Military Academy was in full lockdown. The call had gone out through Sandra's dropped phone. She'd hit the emergency line before it hit the floor, which was either quick thinking or pure reflex, but it worked either way. By the time the first Blackstone PD cruiser was in the parking lot, there were 2 more behind it. By the time the school had moved all students to the gymnasium and the East Classroom wings, the parking lot had 6 vehicles, and someone was setting up a mobile command unit near the flagpole. Lieutenant Carl Weston had been with Blackstone PD for 11 years and had done 2 crisis negotiation trainings that he now wished had been 3. He took the initial brief from the patrol officer who'd gotten there first, looked at the school building, and tried to get a read on who was inside. Gunman's name is Dale Mace, the officer said. 44, no prior record, drove up from Billings. His son Garrett Mace was expelled 3 days ago for a disciplinary violation. The school says they tried to contact the father, but what about the hostage? School nurse, Emily Foster, 31. 2 years at the school, no notable history. The officer shook his head. Honestly, sir, the staff out here are pretty worried about her. Said she's quiet, keeps to herself. They don't think she'll hold it together in there. Weston looked at the building. Get me your personnel file, he said. Inside the office, Douglas Hale had discovered that sitting down in a crisis was actually harder than standing. His legs kept wanting to move. He'd pressed himself into the corner near his filing cabinet and was doing a very poor job of not looking at the window every 30 seconds. Emily had not looked at the window once. She was watching Mace the way a person watches something they're trying to understand. Not with judgment, not with fear, with genuine attention. He'd been talking for 12 minutes. About Garrett, mostly. About driving up from Billings after the letter came. About calling the school 6 times and getting voicemail. About how Garrett had been the one who'd wanted to go to Iron Ridge in the first place. How it had been his idea. How he'd worked for it. Saved for the application fee himself. Sent the essay in without telling his father until after. He's not a bad kid, Mace said. He'd sat down at some point. Emily had noticed the moment it happened without drawing attention to it. He made a mistake. Whatever they told you he did, he made a mistake. That's not who he is. I believe you, Emily said. Mace looked at her like he expected a condition. A but. She didn't add one. What was the violation? She asked. Do you know what they said he did? Fighting, which Garrett doesn't fight. He never... Mace stopped, rubbed his jaw. There was an incident with another cadet last year. The other kid kept going after him, and Garrett never said anything to me about it because he didn't want me to worry. And then 3 weeks ago, something happened in the dormitory, and he hit back, and apparently that's the part that counts. Emily was quiet for a moment. And nobody told you the context, she said. Nobody told me anything. I got a letter with a date and a reason and a list of items to pick up. His voice had gone flat. I've been calling every number on that letter for 3 days and nobody picks up. She looked at him. He had the hands of someone who worked with them, not office work, something physical. The calluses were on the wrong fingers for a desk job. She filed this away. What do you do for work, Mr. Mace? He blinked. The question had come from nowhere, and he knew it. HVAC, why? Because I'm trying to figure out how long it took you to get here, she said. Not the drive, the decision. He looked at the floor. Too long, he said. Hale's phone had been silent since the lockdown, but Emily knew that wouldn't last. At 19 minutes in, it buzzed. Mace looked at it. Hale looked at Emily. That's going to be the negotiator, Emily said. They need to know everyone in here is okay. Everyone's fine, Mace said. Then tell them that, she said. Pick up, say everyone's okay, and hang up. That's it. He hesitated. If you don't answer, she said, they'll start making assumptions. Assumptions make this harder to walk out of, and I think you want to walk out of this. Mace reached over and picked up the phone. Everyone in here is okay, he said. Then he hung up. Hale let out a breath he'd been holding for at least 5 minutes. Outside, Weston had gotten 2 pieces of information almost simultaneously. The phone pickup telling him the hostages were alive, and the personnel file printout one of his officers had pulled from the school's administrative database. He read the file once, read it again. The employment information was standard. 2 years at Iron Ridge, licensed practical nurse, references from a clinic in Bozeman. But behind the employment record, attached to a background clearance form, was a set of verification flags he recognized. The kind that came back from federal databases with access restrictions. The kind that usually meant military service, not standard service, not the kind that showed up in a clean summary paragraph. The kind that were flagged because the records were sealed. Weston stared at the printout. Get me someone from the state police with military liaison experience, he said. Now on. At 26 minutes, Mace started asking questions. It was a pattern Emily had seen before, in rooms worse than this one, in situations with higher stakes and less furniture. The initial surge of adrenaline was burning off. He was coming down from whatever decision had brought him through those front doors, and in its place was the slow, cold arrival of reality. What happens to me? He said. Not exactly a question. That depends on a lot of things, Emily said. Honest. She'd learned a long time ago that false comfort created more problems than it solved. It depends on how this ends. It depends on what they can establish about your intent. It depends on your lawyer. I don't have a lawyer. You'll have one. He looked at his hand, the one in the pocket. He'd almost forgotten it was there, she could tell. He pulled it out and set the gun on the desk. Small frame, dark finish, exactly what she'd estimated. He looked at it like he was surprised to see it. I wasn't going to use it, he said. I know. You knew the whole time? I had a pretty good idea, she said. He turned to look at her. The confusion was back. That specific quality of someone trying to reconcile what they thought they were dealing with and what they were actually dealing with. You're a school nurse, he said. It was almost a question. I am, she said. You don't act like one. She didn't answer that. You're not scared, he said. I had I walked in here with a gun, and you haven't been scared once. She met his eyes. I've been in situations where fear would have gotten people killed, she said. You learned to put it somewhere else. He stared at her. She watched the thought move across his face before he said it, the slow reconstruction of the last half hour, replaying moments with a new variable in place of the one he'd assumed. Who are you? He said. Outside, through the gap under the door, Emily could hear the distant sound of the command unit's radio. She could hear the particular frequency they were using. She recognized it without wanting to, the way you recognize an old song from a time you'd rather not go back to. She didn't answer Mace's question. Not yet. What she said was, "Tell me what Garrett was like before he came here, before Iron Ridge. What was he actually like?" And Mace, despite himself, started talking again, because that was the one question nobody had asked him in 3 days, maybe longer. Outside, the state police liaison had arrived and was standing next to Weston, reading the flagged background file with the careful expression of someone managing surprise. "These flags," he said, "the sealed records." "Yeah," Weston said. "Do you know what you're looking at?" "I know what the flags mean in general terms. I don't have clearance for the specifics." The liaison set the file down on the hood of the nearest cruiser. "The woman in there," he said, "Emily Foster. That's not her original personnel designation." He paused. "She has a military call sign that's still active in the federal system. Those don't stay active unless someone with significant clearance is maintaining them." Weston looked at the school building. "She's a nurse," he said. "She was a nurse," the liaison said. "Among other things." He picked up his radio. "I need to make a call before we do anything else. Don't move anyone closer to that building." Weston turned to look at the man. "Who are you calling?" The liaison didn't answer. He walked 6 steps away, turned his back, and brought the radio to his mouth. Inside Hale's office, Emily heard the frequency shift. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you'd spent your adult life working in schools or clinics or anywhere that didn't require you to track radio traffic as a baseline survival skill. She didn't react. She kept listening to Mace talk about his son, about Garrett's habit of reading military history books and then pretending he hadn't, about the birthday when Garrett was 11 and asked for a compass instead of a game console and seemed genuinely offended when his father acted surprised, about the morning Garrett said he'd applied to Iron Ridge, and the look on his face when he said it, not asking permission, not looking for approval, just stating a fact about his own future with total certainty. Mace had stopped halfway through a sentence. He was watching Emily's face. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "You heard something." She looked at him. He was more perceptive than she'd initially read him, which she noted without judgment. "The radio traffic outside changed," she said. "What does that mean?" She thought about the call sign, the sealed records, the specific frequency she'd just heard cycling through. "It means," she said carefully, "that someone outside just figured out something about me." Mace looked at her. His face had gone through several phases in the last 40 minutes, but this was a new one. Not fear, not confusion, but the specific expression of someone who is starting to understand that the situation they created is considerably more complicated than they thought. "The nurse," he said slowly. "Yes," she said. You weren't always." "No," she said. He looked at the gun on the desk between them, then at her, then at the door. "Someone who's seen people lose everything," he repeated. The words she'd said when he'd first asked who she was. He was recalculating them. Emily said nothing. She could hear the radio traffic had stopped. The change from constant low noise to silence was its own signal. She'd learned what it meant in a different life, in a different kind of room. It meant someone had just given an order. She needed to know which kind. She stood up, moved to the door, and pulled it open 2 inches. Not enough to be visible from the parking lot, just enough to hear. The front hallway was empty. The front doors were closed. But through the narrow gap she could see the parking lot, and what she saw made her process several things at once, in the efficient, stacked way she'd spent years training herself to do when there wasn't time to think sequentially. The tactical unit had pulled back. not repositioned, pulled back. The vehicles were in the same places, but the personnel had moved away from the building perimeter. The command unit was still there, but the officers who'd been crouching near the entrance had retreated toward it. She'd seen that happen exactly twice before. Both times it meant the same thing. Someone with higher authority than everyone currently in this parking lot had just made a call. She pulled the door closed. Mace was watching her. "What did you see?" he said. Emily turned to face him. Behind him, Hale was pressed against the filing cabinet, reading the situation on her face with the focused attention of a man who has decided to outsource all of his risk assessment. "The tactical team outside just received a new order," she said. "Someone with clearance well above local law enforcement just entered this situation." "Because of you," Mace said. It wasn't an accusation, just him piecing it together. "Probably." "What does that mean for me?" She looked at him steadily. "It means," she said, "that you need to understand who you actually grabbed this morning, because whoever they just called, they're not going to call that person for a school nurse." The gun sat between them on the desk. Mace's eyes went to it, then back to her, and in that moment she watched something shift in the mechanics of the room. The balance of who was holding what and who was afraid of whom. He'd walked in here certain about exactly one thing, that he'd brought the leverage. The certainty was gone. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me who you are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the intercom crackled. The intercom didn't say anything at first. It just opened. That flat, electronic hiss of a system coming live. And the silence it broadcast was somehow louder than any announcement. Then a voice came through, male, measured, the kind of controlled tone that didn't come from training videos, but from years of situations where the wrong word at the wrong volume got people killed. "Iron Ridge Academy, this is Colonel James Okafor, Defense Liaison to the Northern Regional Command. We are now coordinating with local law enforcement on scene. All personnel inside the building, staff, students, anyone with a radio, stand by for further instruction." The hiss closed. Dale Mace had not moved. Douglas Hale had pressed himself harder against the filing cabinet, which was not physically possible, but he was attempting it anyway. Emily stood with her hand still on the doorframe and did not change her expression because she'd already processed the voice before it finished the second sentence. She knew that name. Not from Iron Ridge, not from Blackstone, not from anything in the last 2 years of her quiet, carefully constructed civilian life. She knew it from before. Mace turned to look at her. His face had the quality of a man trying to hold a large number of things together at once and not quite managing. "That colonel," he said. "You know him." It wasn't a question this time. "Yes," she said. "And he knows you're in here." "He knows now," she said. She pulled the door closed the rest of the way and came back to the center of the room, which changes the timeline on how long we have to figure this out. "Figure what out?" Hale said from the filing cabinet. It was the first thing he'd said in 20 minutes, and it came out cracked and thin. There's a colonel from the Defense Department on the intercom, and you're talking about a timeline." "Douglas," Emily said, not unkindly, "I need you to be quiet for a few minutes." He closed his mouth. She pulled the chair back out and sat in it. Same chair she'd been in the whole time, same posture, deliberate in the way that communicated to Mace that nothing had changed on her end, regardless of what had just changed on everyone else's. She'd learned early that posture was its own language, and people read it even when they thought they weren't. Mace was reading it. She could tell. "The gun," she said. He looked at the desk. "Not picking it up," she said. "Moving it. Put it on the windowsill behind you, away from both of us, away from the door." "Why?" "Because when people come in here, and they will come in here, it's a question of when, not if. The first thing they're going to look at is that gun, and I'd rather they not look at it close to you." He stared at her. "I'm trying to help you," she said. "You can decide whether you believe that." He picked up the gun by the barrel, crossed to the window, and set it on the sill without turning his back to her for more than 2 seconds. Combat cautious without knowing it, she noticed. The habit of someone who'd once been in a situation where turning your back mattered. "You were in the service," she said. He turned back around. 2 tours, Army. Got out when Garrett was 3. She nodded. Filed it in the same place she was filing everything else. Then you know what that voice meant, she said. On the intercom. He sat down in Hale's desk chair, his first time sitting since they'd come into the room. Something in his shoulders dropped a centimeter. It meant this stopped being a local problem, he said. Yes. Because of you. Because of what they found in my file when they ran my background. He studied her. The confusion had stabilized into something else. Not calm, but a kind of taut attention. The look of someone who has decided that paying close attention to the person in front of them is the most useful thing they can do. You were a combat medic, he said. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. That's not a colonel on the intercom level secret, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The room was quiet. Outside, through the window blinds, she could see the thin bars of light that meant the sun had shifted. Mid-morning. The command unit's radio had been quiet since the colonel's announcement, which meant they were waiting. She'd done enough waiting from the other side of situations like this to know what it looked like. She had maybe 20 minutes before someone decided the waiting wasn't productive. Outside, Colonel James Okafor had commandeered the passenger seat of the state police liaison's vehicle and was reading a printout that had come through on a secure fax from a number that the Blackstone County Sheriff's substation definitely shouldn't have had access to. But when Okafor made calls, access happened. He was 61 years old, black, built like someone who'd spent decades making his body useful rather than impressive, and he had a face that defaulted to unreadable even when he was actively feeling things, which he was currently, though he'd have declined to specify what. He set the printout on the dashboard. How long has she been in there? He said. 52 minutes, Weston said from the back seat. He was present by virtue of being the ranking local officer and now feeling more junior by the minute. Communication has been minimal. One phone pickup, identification of the gunman, confirmation that hostages are okay. Nothing since. Who is the gunman? Dale Mace, 44. Father of a recently expelled cadet. No priors, no weapons charges, licensed gun owner. Drove from Billings. Okafor looked at the building. She's managing him. We don't actually know that. She is, Okafor said. Not with any heat, just with the flatness of someone correcting an error that isn't worth arguing about. The call sign in her file. Has anyone in your department contacted the school administration about it? No, we didn't know what it meant. Good. Keep it that way. Okafor picked up his own radio. Different unit from the one he'd used for the intercom, smaller, encrypted. The intercom announcement was to let her know I'm here. She'll know what it means. Weston looked at the back of the colonel's head. Sir, can I ask, what exactly are we dealing with here? In terms of who she is? Okafor didn't answer immediately. He looked at the front doors of the school for long enough that Weston started to think the question had been lost. Then, you're dealing with someone who, at 23 years old, extracted 4 wounded personnel from a compromised field position under active fire with no backup and improvised medical equipment. He paused. And that's the version of the story I can tell you. Weston sat back. The school staff said they were worried about her, he said. Said she was quiet, that she probably wasn't equipped to handle this. Okafor picked up the encrypted radio again. The school staff have met her twice a year at potlucks, he said. That is not the same thing as knowing her. Inside the office, Emily had stopped watching the clock. Watching the clock was how you made 50 minutes feel like 3 hours. She was watching Mace instead, and what she was watching told her more than any timeline. He'd stopped talking, not shut down. The quality of his silence was different from shutdown. He was thinking. The hands that had been restless for the first half hour were still now, resting on his knees, and he was looking at a spot on the carpet between the 2 chairs that didn't have anything on it. I haven't spoken to Garrett in 4 days, he said. Not to Emily specifically, just said it to the room. When did he get expelled? I told you, 3 days ago. She did the math. You found out before he did. They sent the letter to the home address. He's not in contact with his mother, so they had me as the primary. He rubbed the side of his face. He called me the day after. Collect call from the school's phone. I said the wrong things. I was angry. Not at him, I was angry at the school, but I was on the phone with him and I said the wrong things. Emily waited. He hung up, Mace said. Garrett hung up, and I've been calling the school for 3 days trying to get someone to tell me what actually happened so I can call him back and say something that doesn't make it worse. She understood something then that she hadn't fully understood before she had all the pieces. This wasn't a father who'd driven 9 hours to storm a school. This was a father who'd spent 3 days in a shrinking circle of panic and no answers, and had made a catastrophic decision in the parking lot because he'd run out of every other option he could think of. The gun had probably been in his truck already. He was a man who drove 9 hours through Montana in March. She knew that kind of driver. The gun wasn't premeditation. It was geography. It didn't make what he'd done okay, but it made it comprehensible. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "On the phone." He shook his head. "You don't want to know." "I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. "I said he should have known better, that he'd worked too hard to get here to throw it away over a fight." He paused. "And then I said that I didn't raise him to be someone who got kicked out of things." The room was very still. Emily looked at him and did not say anything for 4 full seconds, which was long enough to let him sit in it. "What happened with the other cadet?" she said, "the one who'd been going after him." "I don't know. The school won't tell me details." "Did Garrett tell you anything about it? In that phone call?" Mace's jaw tightened. "He tried to. I was talking over him." He stopped. "I was so angry that I wasn't listening, and then he hung up." She leaned forward slightly in the chair, not toward him, just a shift in orientation that signaled engagement without pressure. "Garrett applied to this school himself," she said. "Saved for the application fee. Sent the essay in before he told you." "Yeah. That's not a kid who throws things away," she said. "That's a kid who was protecting something." Mace looked up. "Kids who protect things fight back when those things are threatened," she said. "That's not failure. That's the same instinct that made him want to come here." His eyes were doing something complicated. She watched him work through it. The reinterpretation, the replacement of the frame he'd been using for 3 days with a different one. "The school didn't give him context," she said. "They gave you a code violation and a date. That's not the same thing." "No," he said, quietly. "It's not." He looked at the window. Through the slats of the closed blinds, a sliver of the parking lot was visible. Vehicles, figures in the distance. "I made it worse," he said. "You can make it better," she said, "but not from in here." He turned back to her. The gun was on the sill behind him, and neither of them had mentioned it in 20 minutes. "That colonel," he said. "What's he going to do when this ends?" "He's going to want to talk to me," she said. "That's mostly about me, not you." "And me?" "You'll be processed, arrested. There's no version of this where that doesn't happen. But the fact that no one is hurt, that you put the gun down yourself, that I can tell them what happened in here, that matters. It will matter." He looked at his hands. "Garrett's going to find out," he said. "About today." "Yes." He's going to think his father drove 9 hours because he couldn't get anyone to listen," she said. "And he won't be entirely wrong." At the hour and 6-minute mark, 2 things happened at almost exactly the same time. The first was that the Blackstone PD dispatcher relayed a request from Colonel Okafor to open a direct phone line to the office where the hostages were being held. Weston agreed. The call came through on Hale's desk phone at 10:03 a.m. Emily answered it. "Foster," Okafor said. "Colonel?" she said. There was a pause that contained 17 years of intermittent contact, 2 periods of silence that had lasted over a year each, and a working relationship built on the understanding that neither of them would say more than was operationally necessary. "Status," he said. "Stable. 1 subject, non-hostile at this point. 1 civilian colleague. No injuries." She paused. "The subject has a history of service. 2 Army tours." "Understood." Another pause. "We're not going to rush this." "I know," she said. "Give me time." "You have it. Within reason." His voice shifted fractionally. Not softer exactly, but different. Less call sign to call sign. You okay? Yes, she said. I need that to be accurate, not just a response. I know what you need, she said. I'm fine. She hung up. Mace had been watching her through the entire call. He'd caught the single word she'd used to address the colonel. Not sir, not colonel, just the rank, flat and direct. And she could see him reprocessing the room again. He asked if you were okay, he said. Yes. You didn't sound like someone reporting to a superior. No, she said. He tilted his head. How long did you serve? She looked at him steadily. Long enough that I know what you're carrying, she said. The exit guilt. The feeling that you made a choice to come home and everything that went wrong afterward is the bill for that choice. His face went through something that he quickly tried to shut down. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He looked at the floor. 2 tours, she said. Second one ended. She read the scar geometry on the back of his right hand, visible when he'd rubbed his jaw earlier. Not the way you planned. He covered his right hand with his left. Shrapnel, he said. After a moment. IED on the second deployment. 3 guys in the vehicle. I was the only one who came out using both legs. The room held that for a moment. And you came home to Garrett, she said. He was 3. He didn't know who I was. A beat. Or what I'd done to deserve coming back instead of them. She'd heard variations of that sentence hundreds of times, in the mouths of people who'd earned medals for actions they couldn't forgive themselves for. In her own head, at 3 a.m., in the 3rd year after she left. Survival isn't something you earn, she said. It just happens, and then you live with it. He looked up. Something in his expression had gone raw. Not broken, not collapsed, just stripped of the armor that had been running at full capacity for 3 days and was out of fuel. Is that what you told yourself? He said. She thought about a hillside she hadn't thought about in 2 weeks, which was the longest stretch she'd managed. Some version of it, she said. I'm still working on whether it took. At the hour and 21-minute mark, the second thing happened. It came from outside, not from the command unit, not from Okafor, but from somewhere on the east side of the building. A voice, young and sharp, carrying through the thin walls of the administrative wing with the specific panic that bypassed controlled communication entirely. Someone's down. Cadet down on the east quad. The voice cut off, or moved away, or was told to get on a proper channel. Emily caught maybe 6 words total, but 6 words were enough. She stood up. Stay here, she said to Mace. Then to Hale. Douglas, stay in this room. What's happening? Hale started. She was already at the door. The hallway was empty. Lockdown had cleared it an hour ago. But she could hear radio traffic through the east wing doors, the double set that separated the administrative corridor from the classroom wing. She moved toward them without running, because running in a lockdown school with police outside was the kind of thing that got misread fast. Through the door's narrow window, she could see the east quad, the interior courtyard that served as the junior cadet assembly area. And on the pavement, near the far bench, a figure was down. 17, maybe 18, in the academy's standard-issue gray winter uniform. 2 other cadets were crouching over him. One was on a phone. The other had a hand on his shoulder and was saying something Emily couldn't hear. She could see from here the posture, the particular way the boy's body had gone rigid, then was starting to go the other direction. The skin color she could make out even at this distance and through a window. The gray-blue at the lips that had nothing to do with cold. Severe bronchospasm. Maybe 10 minutes in, maybe less. She went back to the supply room. The supply room was 2 doors down and kept locked. She had the key. She also had her medication bag, real, stocked, not the decorative kit that some school nurses kept for appearances, because she'd been rebuilding her emergency supplies since the first week on the job, quietly and without explaining to anyone why she thought Iron Ridge needed a trauma-capable nurse more than it needed someone to dispense Tylenol. She grabbed the bag, albuterol, ipratropium, epinephrine auto-injector, a pulse ox. Spare O2 canister from the secondary shelf that she'd requisitioned in November, and nobody had asked about. She went back to the east wing doors and hit the intercom button on the wall panel. This is Emily Foster, school nurse. I have a visual on a cadet in the East Quad who appears to be in respiratory distress. I need clearance to access the quad through the East Wing doors. Static. Then, ma'am, the building is in lockdown. I know it's in lockdown. That's why I'm on the intercom instead of just walking out there. She kept her voice level. I have a student who is going to have a hypoxic event if someone doesn't provide bronchodilator treatment in the next 8 minutes. I need clearance. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Okafor's voice on a different channel. Give her clearance. Now. The door lock clicked. Emily pushed through. Quad. The two cadets near the boy looked up when she came across the quad. One of them, girl, dark hair, the stripe of a junior officer on her shoulder, started to say something, and Emily held up her hand without breaking stride. Tell me his name and his history, she said, dropping to one knee. Cadet Marcus Webb. He's asthmatic. He has an inhaler, but he said he left it in the dorm when we went to... The girl caught herself. When we went to the gymnasium for the lockdown, he's been having trouble breathing for like 15 minutes. We called it in, but nobody... It's okay. Emily already had the pulse ox on his finger. 81%. That was bad. She had the albuterol mask out and over his face in 30 seconds. Canister connected. Flow rate adjusted. Marcus, look at me. He did. The eyes were tracking. Good. Scared, but tracking. You're having a bad attack, she said. I'm giving you medicine. You need to breathe through this mask. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow. He tried. Failed. Tried again. Again, she said. Not harsh, just keeping him in motion. Don't chase the breath. Let it come. The two cadets flanking her had gone very still. The girl with the officer stripe had her hands pressed together in front of her mouth and was watching Emily's hands move. Emily was aware, peripherally, that she was in the middle of an open courtyard during an active lockdown. She was aware that there were law enforcement officers around the perimeter of the building who had a visual on her and were making decisions based on what they saw. She was aware that Dale Mace was still sitting in Douglas Hale's office, and that the situation she'd spent the last 90 minutes carefully stabilizing was now unattended. She was also aware that the boy in front of her had a pulse ox of 81%, and that the albuterol was going to take 3 minutes to make a dent, and he needed all of her attention for those 3 minutes. She gave it to him. At the 2-minute mark, his breathing was still labored, but the rigidity was easing. At 3 minutes, the pulse ox read 86%. She watched his color. The blue at the lips was receding, replaced by the pink that meant blood oxygen was climbing back toward functional. There you go, she said. That's it. Marcus Webb blinked at her. His eyes had cleared slightly. The specific panic of someone who couldn't pull air in was retreating, replaced by the exhausted confusion of someone coming back from an edge they hadn't expected to be near. The nurse, he said, muffled through the mask. Yeah, she said. Weren't you in the front office? He'd clearly heard some version of the morning's events because his face was doing something between gratitude and bewilderment. With the focus on breathing, she said. Miss Foster. A voice from behind her, male, measured, not Okafor, but with the same quality of someone who'd trained their voice for high-stakes environments. She didn't turn immediately. She checked Marcus's pulse ox one more time. 89%. Climbing. Then she turned. 2 officers in tactical gear were at the edge of the quad, having come through the building's north exit. They were not approaching, maintaining distance, weapons down, body language at an aggressive neutral that meant they'd been specifically told not to escalate. Behind them, visible through the gap between the north wing and the auxiliary building, she could see Okafor. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot with his arms folded, and he was watching her. He'd been watching her since she'd come through the east wing doors, she realized, the whole time. He'd seen her cross the quad, drop to her knee, pull out the medication bag. He'd seen her work. His expression was not readable at this distance. She turned back to Marcus. The second cadet, boy, red-haired, had been silent the whole time, was watching her with the specific expression of a teenager who is updating a very significant opinion in real time. He needs to stay sitting, she said to the girl with the officer stripe. Don't let him stand up for at least another 5 minutes. His O2 is coming up, but if he moves too fast, it'll drop again. She held up the second albuterol canister. If his breathing gets worse again before the medics get here, same mask, same flow rate. You press here. She showed her the valve. You can do that? The girl straightened. Yes, ma'am. Good. Emily stood up. She looked at the tactical officers at the north exit, then at the east wing doors she'd come through. Mace was in that building, 93 minutes into a situation that she'd been managing at close range. She'd left him with Hale, who was good at exactly one thing in a crisis, which was staying in the corner. Okafor's voice had told her they weren't going to rush, but Okafor was a colonel, and colonels had limits on how long they could hold back a situation before institutional pressure took over. She walked back to the east wing doors. One of the tactical officers started to follow. I'm going back in, she said, without turning around. The gunman is less dangerous than the situation right now. Let me go back in. She didn't wait for an answer. She pushed through the doors. The hallway was still empty. Her footsteps were the only sound. She passed the supply room, door still open, the way she'd left it in the 10-second stop to grab her bag, and came back to Hale's office. The door was closed the way she'd left it. She opened it. Hale was still at the filing cabinet. He looked like someone had drained about 40% of the color out of him, but he was upright and functional. Mace was at the window. He'd separated 2 slats of the blind with 2 fingers and was looking out at the parking lot. He turned when she came in. She registered 2 things immediately. The gun was still on the windowsill, and Mace's face, which had gone through approximately 6 different phases in the last 2 hours, had arrived at something new, something she hadn't seen on him yet. He'd been watching out that window. He'd seen the courtyard from this angle. Not directly, the geometry was wrong, but close enough to catch something of what had happened on the east side of the building. That was you, he said. Out there. Cadet had a respiratory crisis, she said. I handled it. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the confused recalculation of earlier, something else. You could have walked out, he said. When they opened the door to let you get to the kid, you could have you were outside. You could have walked away from this. Emily set the medication bag on the chair. You would have been alone in here with Douglas, she said, and Douglas has been one difficult moment away from a breakdown for the last hour and a half. She glanced at Hale, who had the decency to look somewhere else. That's not a stable situation. So you came back for me, Mace said, after everything. I came back because the situation wasn't resolved, she said. He shook his head. No. He looked at her the way people looked when they were sure about something. You came back because you don't leave people. She didn't answer that. It was too accurate to argue with and too personal to confirm. Mace turned back to the window. His hand was no longer near the windowsill. The gun might as well have been in a different room. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice had dropped. Not emotional, just quieter, more deliberate. About why I really drove 9 hours. She waited. It's not just the expulsion, he said. It's that Garrett called me 4 days ago, before the letter, before any of this. And he said something I didn't know what to do with. She crossed the room and sat in her chair again. What did he say? Mace turned away from the window. His eyes had the careful quality of someone choosing their words with more precision than they were used to. He said he joined Iron Ridge because of me, he said. Not to be like me. Not because he thought the military was glamorous. He paused. He said he joined because he thought if he understood what I went through, he might understand why I came back different. Why I've been different his whole life. The room was very quiet. And I didn't know what to say to that, Mace said. So I said nothing. And then 2 days later, the letter came. Emily looked at him. He's been trying to reach you, she said. For years. In the only language he thought you'd understand. Mace's jaw worked. He turned back to the window. Outside, she heard the radio traffic shift again. A different frequency. The kind of channel swap that meant coordination was changing levels. She heard a voice she didn't recognize, and then Okafor's voice cutting across it, and then something that was not words, but was clearly an instruction being delivered with the specific authority of someone who was done negotiating with the layer of bureaucracy beneath them. And then the intercom system clicked on again. The hiss filled the room. But this time, instead of Okafor's voice, What came through the Iron Ridge Academy intercom system was a 2-second burst of sound, a code, a call sign, a sequence of numbers and phonetic letters that Emily Foster had not heard spoken aloud since the day she walked away from the service and specifically asked to never hear it again. Her own call sign, broadcast over the school intercom. To a building that contained cadets in a gymnasium, teachers in locked classrooms, a desperate father with a gun on a windowsill, and a school nurse who had spent 2 years and 4 months being nobody's anything. Mace heard it. He turned from the window. He looked at her face. And whatever he saw there, the thing that crossed her expression in the half-second before she locked it back down, told him more than any file, any sealed record, any colonel on an intercom ever could have. Foster, he said. Just her name. She was already on her feet, not moving toward the door, not moving toward the window, just standing. Standing the way you stand when something you buried a long time ago surfaces in a room full of people, and you have absolutely no idea what it means that someone chose this exact moment to dig it up. The call sign was rallentando. It was a musical term, slowing down, and someone with either a sense of irony or a complete lack of it had assigned it to Emily Foster during her second operational year when she was 24 years old and had demonstrated, under evaluation, the specific ability to slow her physiological stress response in high-pressure environments until her hands were steadier under fire than most people's were drinking coffee. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 6 years. She heard it now, over a school intercom, and the effect was not nostalgia. Mace was watching her. She became aware that her hands had gone very still at her sides. Not the controlled stillness she deployed deliberately, but the locked stillness of a system that had taken an unexpected input and was sorting out what to do with it. She recognized the difference and didn't like it. She moved first. She went to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. Not running. Walking at the pace that said, I am in control of this movement rather than I am reacting. The hallway was still empty in both directions. The east wing doors were closed. The front office, through its interior window, showed Sandra's empty desk and the dropped phone still on the floor where it had landed 2 hours ago. She went to the wall panel intercom near the office entrance and pressed the outbound button. Okafor, she said. Not a question, not a greeting, just his name. 3 seconds of static, then, I need you to understand that was not my call. She kept her voice level. Whose was it? Someone who outranks me and decided that establishing your identity to the subject would accelerate resolution. A pause. I've been informed the thinking was that he'd stand down faster if he understood who he was dealing with. The thinking was wrong, she said. I was handling it. I know that. Who? Another pause. Longer. Brigadier General Harlow. He's been looped in since the liaison call. He knows your file, Emily. He's interfering with an active situation, she said. If Mace panics, if he decides I've been running some kind of play on him this whole time. Is he going to? She stopped. Thought about the conversation in that office. The stripped-down quality Mace had arrived at over 2 hours. The gun on the windowsill. The way he'd said you don't leave people like he was identifying something he recognized. I don't know, she said, which was the honest answer, and she gave it because Okafor had always been worth honest answers. Get back in there, he said. Whatever Harlow wanted to accomplish, it's done. You've got the room. She released the intercom button. She stood in the hallway for 2 seconds. Not composing herself. She didn't need to compose herself. She needed to be accurate about what she was walking back into, and she needed those 2 seconds to be accurate. Mace had 2 tours and exit guilt and 3 days of compounding panic and a son who'd been trying to speak his language for years. He was not, at his core, a man looking for a fight. He was a man who had run out of ways to be heard. She went back into the office. Mace hadn't moved from the center of the room. He'd picked up the gun from the windowsill. He was holding it at his side, not raised, not aimed, just held, the way you hold something when you're not sure yet what you're going to do with it. Hale had gone approximately the color of old paper. Emily came in and left the door open behind her. Deliberate. She crossed to her chair and sat in it and looked at Mace without making the gun the center of what she was looking at. That was my call sign, she said. He was watching her face. Military. Yes. What does it mean? It means someone outside decided you should know who I am before I'd finished deciding how to tell you. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at her. Were you running a play on me? He said. This whole time. No, she said. How do I know that? You don't, she said. Not with certainty, but you've been in a room with me for 2 hours and you've been reading people in hard situations since your first deployment. What does it feel like? He held her eyes for a long moment. His grip on the gun shifted. Not tighter, looser. It feels like you were telling me the truth, he said. I was. He put the gun back on the windowsill, not with the deliberateness of a man surrendering it, just setting it down because it was in his hand and he didn't want it there anymore. Hale let out a breath. Emily didn't react to the breath. Ralentando, Mace said, like he was testing the sound of it. Slowing down. Yes. That's what you've been doing, he said. This whole time, slowing everything down. It's what the situation needed. He sat back down in Hale's chair. He looked at his hands, both of them, the scarred right and the unmarked left, and then at the ceiling, and then at some middle distance that was probably not in this room at all. The call sign, he said, broadcasting it like that. They wanted me to know you're not just a nurse. Yes. Why? What was the point? Someone outside thought it would make you stand down faster. She paused. They were probably right, technically, but it wasn't the right move for the rest of it. He frowned. The rest of what? You and Garrett, she said. After today. How you walk out of this and what you carry when you do. She leaned forward. If you stand down because someone told you the woman in the room is military and you got scared, you'll spend the next year telling yourself a story about how you were outmaneuvered. That's not the same as choosing. He was quiet. I needed you to choose, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had gone past the point of complicated into something simpler on the other side of it. You're something else, he said. Not admiringly. Just as a statement about the nature of reality that he was still adjusting to. She didn't respond to that. What she said was, tell me something about Garrett that has nothing to do with Iron Ridge. He told her Garrett was terrible at cooking but refused to admit it, and that he'd been making the same undercooked scrambled eggs on weekends since he was 13 and presenting them with total confidence every single time. He told her Garrett had a habit of underlining passages in his books and then being embarrassed when someone noticed. He told her that 2 years ago, when Mace had come home from a job 3 states over and found Garrett alone in the house, his mother had been gone for 4 years by then, the kid had just said, "You're late," and handed him a plate of the undercooked eggs, and that had been the whole homecoming. Emily listened. Not as a tactic this time, just listened. She was aware, in the background of her attention, that something outside had changed. The radio traffic, she'd been tracking it at low register the whole morning, the way she tracked most ambient sound, had shifted in cadence, more traffic, shorter intervals, the pattern of a situation moving toward action rather than holding. She clocked it and kept listening to Mace. At the point where he was describing the compass Garrett had asked for on his 11th birthday, not the cheap plastic kind, a real one, he'd looked up the specific model. The east wing door opened, not the door to the office. The exterior east wing door at the end of the hallway. She heard it from where she sat. The specific sound of a reinforced door being opened with controlled force, the kind of controlled that meant trained personnel moving on a schedule. Mace heard it too. His head came up. What? Stay in the chair, Emily said. She was already on her feet. She went to the office door and looked down the hallway. 4 members of a tactical response team were at the east wing entrance, full kit, rifles down but positioned, moving in the stacked entry formation she recognized from a different context entirely. Behind them, visible through the open door, was a second team on the exterior. They were moving toward the administrative corridor. Someone had ended the waiting. She stepped into the hallway. Hold, she said. The lead officer stopped. His team stopped. The body language was not comfortable. They'd been moving toward an objective, and the obstacle in their path was a woman in a cardigan, and they were recalculating in real time. Ma'am, we have authorization to... From who? She said. General Harlow has ordered... Okafor, she said, and she didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. The hallway carried it fine. Okafor, I know you can hear this. Either you're on someone's earpiece or you're on the door. Either way. 4 seconds of nothing. Then the lead officer's earpiece crackled. She watched him listen. She watched his expression shift. Not much, but she'd spent years reading minimal shifts. He'd received a countermand. He held up a closed fist. His team stopped moving. She went back into the office. Mace was on his feet. He'd registered the tactical entry sounds for what they were. He had too much background not to. And his whole body had gone taut with the specific readiness of a man who'd just heard something that triggered 2 tours of muscle memory. They were coming in, he said. They stopped, she said. For how long? She didn't have an answer she was confident in, so she didn't give one. Instead, she said, "Sit down. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it while you're sitting down." He sat, slowly, not entirely convinced, but sitting. She stood in front of him. "When I was 26, she said, I made a decision in a field position that cost someone their life. Someone who was following my lead. She said it the way she said everything, flat, factual, without the decorative damage that would have made it sound more like what it felt like. I had the right information, and I made the wrong call anyway. And I have been—" She paused, and the pause was not theatrical. It was the genuine stop of someone choosing whether to finish the sentence, "living with that in a school clinic in Montana for 2 years. Mace was very still. "I'm not telling you that so you feel sorry for me," she said. "I'm telling you because you drove 9 hours carrying your version of the same thing, and you walked in here believing that a gun was the only door left." She looked at him steadily. "There are other doors. I promise you there are. But you have to be standing outside this building to walk through them." He looked at the floor. "Garrett," she said, "he admires you. That call 4 days ago. He wasn't asking you to explain yourself. He was trying to tell you he sees you, all of it, and he's still there." Mace's jaw worked. "Don't lose him too," she said. The silence went on long enough that she could hear the radio traffic outside cycling through another pattern shift. The tactical team would have a hold time. She didn't know how long it was. Mace looked up. His eyes were doing the thing that eyes did when someone was right at the edge of a decision that they couldn't come back from once they made it, and they knew it, and they were trying to get there anyway. He stood up, crossed to the windowsill, picked up the gun. She watched his hands, always watched the hands, and turned it grip first. He set it on the desk between them, not near himself, near her. And then the hallway exploded with sound. Not gunfire, not the team. Something different, sharp, bright, multiple voices shouting in the overlapping cascade of people responding to something they hadn't expected. Through the east wing door she heard running, not tactical running, cadet running, the uncontrolled sprint of teenagers who were supposed to be in the gymnasium and weren't. She moved to the door. At the far end of the hallway, through the east wing window, she could see the quad. Marcus Webb, the asthmatic cadet, the one she'd treated 40 minutes ago, was on his feet. He wasn't alone. There were 6 other cadets with him, all in the gray winter uniform, all standing in formation in the middle of the east courtyard despite the lockdown, despite the tactical teams at the perimeter, despite everything. They were standing in a row facing the administrative wing, facing this office. And Marcus Webb, at 17 years old, still running slightly short on O2, and knowing it, had clearly decided that this was the moment to make a choice about what kind of cadet he wanted to be when it counted. He saluted. The other 6 did the same. Emily stared through the window. She did not move for a full 3 seconds. Mace appeared at her shoulder. He looked out. He looked at her face. "They know who you are," he said. Emily did not answer. She was watching 7 cadets hold a salute in an empty courtyard in the middle of a lockdown for a school nurse they'd barely spoken to, and the tactical team at the east entrance, who absolutely had orders to clear the quad, was not moving, because someone had finally told them what they were looking at. She heard the radio crackle. She heard a voice she didn't recognize say 4 words that meant the hold order was expiring. She heard Okafor's voice cut across it, fast and low, and then she heard another voice, harder, with the particular compression of a general officer who has run out of patience, say, "Stand aside, Colonel." The east wing door opened. The east wing door opened and Brigadier General Patricia Harlow walked through it like she owned the building, which, in the way that generals occupied space, she effectively did the moment she arrived. She was 63, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that didn't come from good habits, but from decades of being in rooms where posture communicated rank before the stars on your collar did. She wore civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, which made her presence more unsettling, not less. She had two people flanking her, a uniformed aide who was staying very close to her left shoulder, and a man in a suit who Emily didn't recognize but whose bearing said federal and whose eyes said lawyer. Okafor was 3 steps behind her. His expression, readable to Emily and probably nobody else in the hallway, said, "I tried." Harlow stopped in the corridor and looked at Emily, then past Emily at Dale Mace, then at the desk, where the gun was sitting grip-side toward the wall. She took this in with the efficient inventory of someone accustomed to walking into situations midstream and getting up to speed in 30 seconds. "Mr. Mace," she said. Her voice was measured, not warm, but not aggressive. The specific neutral of someone who had learned to keep their register calibrated. "I'm General Harlow. I'm glad everyone in this room is okay." Mace was standing near the filing cabinet. He looked at Emily. One brief glance that asked a question. "It's fine," Emily said, meaning, "I know who she is," not meaning, "this is fine." Harlow looked at Emily. "Foster." "General?" The two of them held the look for exactly as long as was necessary to communicate a significant amount of information without speaking any of it aloud. Harlow broke first. Not concession, calculation. She turned to the aide. "Get the gun off that desk and document it." "It's evidence," Emily said. "Chain of custody." Harlow looked at her. "Blackstone PD has jurisdiction on the criminal side of this," Emily said. "Your aide touches that weapon before their officer documents its position and logs it. The DA has a problem, and Mr. Mace has a problem." She paused. "I don't think you want either of those problems." Harlow was still looking at her. The look had acquired a new quality. Not irritation exactly, something closer to the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption they'd arrived with. She turned to the aide. "Get Weston in here." What followed was 40 minutes of controlled procedural chaos, the kind that Emily had seen often enough to navigate, but that reduced Douglas Hale to sitting in his own desk chair making a sound periodically that wasn't quite words. Weston arrived and documented the weapon. A Blackstone PD officer took Mace's formal statement in the hallway while Emily stood close enough to hear and far enough to be technically uninvolved. Mace was cuffed. The officer was professional about it, no theater, and walked toward the parking lot with his shoulders straight and his head up in the way of a man who had made a decision and was going to hold it. He stopped at the door. He turned and looked back at Emily. She was standing in the hallway, and she let him look. "Garrett," he said, "just the name." "I'll make sure someone tells him what you did," she said, "not how it started, what you chose." He held her eyes for a second, then nodded. The officer moved him through the door and into the cold March parking lot, and Emily watched him go and then turned around because there was still a building full of problems that hadn't resolved themselves. Harlow was waiting. "My office," Emily said. "It's smaller than this one, but it's mine." "What?" The clinic was exactly what it was. Antiseptic smell, old carpet, the evacuation map on the wall with its red marker notations. And Harlow walked into it and looked around with an expression that Emily couldn't fully interpret. The aide and the federal lawyer stayed in the hallway. Okafor came in and stood near the supply cabinet. 3 people in a small room, and the room was full. Harlow looked at the evacuation map, at the notations, at the routes marked in red. 2 years, she said. 2 years and 4 months, Emily said. And nobody asked about the map. Nobody asked about anything. Harlow turned. She had the look of someone who had prepared a version of this conversation and was now recalculating it. "The intercom," Emily said. "My call sign." "We needed him to understand." "I had him," Emily said. Her voice was even. "He'd put the gun down. He was talking. He was 40 minutes from walking out of that office himself, without a tactical team, without a scene, without anything that makes the next 6 months of legal proceedings complicated." She paused. "You broadcast my call sign over a school intercom in front of a man with a firearm and 2 civilian witnesses without consulting me or Okafor, And you did it because you wanted to accelerate a timeline that didn't need accelerating. Harlow's jaw was set. It worked. It almost didn't, Emily said. He picked the gun back up, General. When that intercom came on, he picked it back up. I was 3 feet away from him and he picked it up. She let that sit. If I hadn't been able to read him well enough to know he wasn't going to use it, we would be having a very different conversation right now. The room was quiet. Okafor, near the supply cabinet, was looking at the middle distance. Harlow said, "Why didn't you identify yourself to him earlier? It would have shortened this by an hour." "Because shortening it wasn't the goal," Emily said. "Ending it right was the goal." He needed to choose to walk out, not be intimidated into it. She looked at the general. "You've read my file. You know why the distinction matters." Something moved across Harlow's face. It was brief and she controlled it fast, but Emily caught it. The specific flicker of someone being reminded of something they'd rather have kept as an abstraction. "Aveldin?" Harlow said. The word landed in the room with the particular weight of a proper noun that carried a lot of history compressed into 3 syllables. Emily didn't answer. "The operation in Aveldin," Harlow said. 2019, the decision that ended your service." "Yes. I've read it. The full file, not the summary." Harlow paused. "You were right, in your assessment. The board concluded your call was tactically sound given the intelligence you had." "The board concluded that after Specialist Reyes was already dead," Emily said. "The timeline on that conclusion doesn't change what happened." "No," Harlow said. "It doesn't." The 3 of them stood in the clinic. Through the door, Emily could hear the building coming back to life. The distant sound of students being moved from the gymnasium back toward their quarters. The administrative shuffling of a school trying to resume something like normal after a morning that had been anything but. "Why Blackstone?" Harlow asked. Not the question Emily had expected first. "It was far," Emily said. Harlow looked at her. "From everything," Emily said, "that was the criteria." "'Cause the students came back through the east corridor in supervised groups, and Emily heard them before she saw them. She was in the hallway outside the clinic by then, watching the process. Cadets walking in formation that was slightly too loose to be official. The specific gait of teenagers who had spent 3 hours in a gymnasium being told to stay calm, and were now releasing the compressed tension of that in the form of louder than usual conversation. She saw Marcus Webb in the 3rd group. He was walking on his own, breathing normally, the slightly flat affect of someone who'd had a rough physiological morning and was running on the tail end of it. He had a borrowed inhaler in his breast pocket. He saw her and didn't do anything dramatic, just gave her a nod, the kind that acknowledged something real without making a scene of it. She nodded back. The girl with the officer's stripe, she'd learned the name by now, Cadet Lieutenant Dessa Park, 16 years old, the one who'd held the albuterol canister instructions without flinching, was 2 groups back. She met Emily's eyes and held them for a second, then looked away. The salute in the courtyard had been her call, Emily had worked out. Marcus had gone down, she'd organized 6 others. She'd made a decision under pressure that nobody asked her to make. Emily filed that away. Dessa Park was going to be significant to someone someday, and she hoped it was in better circumstances than a lockdown. The last group was the juniors, and in the juniors, Emily saw a face that stopped her mid-thought. She recognized him from the photograph she'd pulled off school files after his first week. She did that with all the enrolled students, built a reference map in her head of who belonged here and what their relevant medical history was. She hadn't met him personally. He'd never been to her clinic. But she knew the jaw, the way he held himself with the specific upright bearing of someone who'd practiced it past the point of conscious effort. Cadet Junior Garrett Mace. He was walking with 2 other cadets, and he was not making conversation. He had the inward look of someone who'd spent 3 hours in a gymnasium being told that an armed man had taken over the administrative wing and then being given very little other information. He looked, Emily thought, like someone who had done the math. He glanced at her as he passed. No recognition. They'd never spoken. She was just a door he was walking past. She almost let him go. "Cadet Mace." He stopped. The 2 cadets with him stopped, looked at Emily, looked at Garrett, and had the social intelligence to keep walking. Garrett turned. He was 17, taller than his father by an inch or two, with the same hands, the same broad, work-shaped hands, though his were unmarked. He looked at Emily with the expression of someone trying to figure out what category of adult trouble they were currently in. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet, doing the math again in real time, watching her face. "My father," he said. It wasn't a question. "He's okay," she said. "He's been arrested, and that's going to be a hard road for him, and I won't pretend otherwise, but he's okay." Garrett's jaw worked. His eyes didn't do the complicated things she might have expected from a kid who just found out his father walked into his school with a gun. They did something more singular, grief, direct, without the layers of anger over it that usually cushion that kind of news. "He drove up," Garrett said. 9 hours, Emily said, because the school wouldn't call him back. She didn't answer that directly. "Because he ran out of other ways to be heard," she said. "That's not an excuse for what he did, but it's accurate." Garrett looked at the floor. "I hung up on him," he said. 4 days ago. He said the wrong things, and I hung up." "I know," she said. "He told me." He looked up. "He also told me about the compass," she said. "The one you asked for when you were 11. The specific model." Something in Garrett's face fractured slightly. Not dramatically. A small give, the kind that happened when someone said the exact right thing at the exact wrong time. He looked down again quickly. "He remembered that?" he said. Quiet, like he wasn't sure the question should be out loud. "He remembers everything," Emily said. "He's just very bad at saying so." She let him have a moment. She was aware they were standing in a corridor and that there was a returning formation behind him, and that someone from the administrative staff was going to notice the holdup shortly. "You should know," she said, "that the call sign they broadcast over the intercom was mine. And the reason your father didn't walk out of that office earlier was partly because he was trying to understand who I was. And by the time he did, he'd already made a different decision." She paused. "He chose to put the gun down before anyone made him. That matters. It matters legally, and it matters for everything else." Garrett absorbed this. "He could have left," he said slowly. "If it was a military situation, if you were—" He could have been intimidated into backing down. "Yes." But he wasn't. "No." He looked at her steadily. The assessment in his eyes was exact in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of his father's increasing sharpness over 2 hours in a small room. "You made sure of that," he said, "that it was his choice." She didn't confirm it. She said, "Contact visiting protocol for Blackstone County. There will be a number on the arrest documentation." She held his gaze. "Use it." He nodded once. Sharp, like someone filing an instruction for immediate action. Then he turned and rejoined the returning formation, and Emily watched his back until he'd rounded the corner at the end of the corridor. The formal debrief happened in the Academy's conference room at 2 p.m., and it was uncomfortable in the specific way of gatherings where multiple people with different kinds of authority had to share a table and each of them knew exactly where they stood in relation to every other person present. Harlow was at the head of the table. Weston was there representing Blackstone PD with a sergeant he'd brought for documentation. Okafor sat to Harlow's left and said very little and watched everything. The federal lawyer, his name turned out to be Briggs, DOJ, which explained the bearing, had a yellow legal pad and a pen he kept clicking. The Iron Ridge Academy superintendent, a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had been reached by phone in Helena at 10:45 that morning and had driven 3 hours with his emergency flashers on, sat at the far end of the table looking like a man who had aged significantly since breakfast. Emily sat in the middle, not at either end. She'd chosen the chair before anyone else arranged themselves, which had caused a minor ripple of adjustment, and she hadn't apologized for it. Ashworth opened his mouth 3 times before he actually produced words. "I want to begin by saying that the Academy deeply regrets the debrief first," Harlow said. "Regrets after." Ashworth closed his mouth. Harlow looked at Weston. "Criminal status on Dale Mace. Booked at county at 12:18 p.m. Charges will include unlawful restraint, criminal menacing, and possession of a firearm in a school zone. DA will determine if additional federal charges apply given the DOJ involvement. Weston glanced at Briggs. His public defender request has been logged. What's the likely outcome? Ashworth asked. Not my call, Weston said. He has no record. The incident lasted under 2 hours. No one was injured. He surrendered the weapon voluntarily, and there are mitigating circumstances the court will weigh. He paused. He's looking at time served plus probation at the low end, assuming a competent defense, which he glanced at Emily without quite meaning to. Several people seem motivated to help him access. Emily said nothing. The expulsion, Harlow said, looking at Ashworth. Cadet Garrett Mace. Ashworth straightened. The academy followed its disciplinary protocol. The academy expelled a student for retaliating against documented harassment without first making contact with his parent, Briggs said. He clicked the pen. Do you know what the notification requirements are under your institutional charter, Superintendent? Ashworth blinked. We sent a letter. A letter sent 3 days before any phone contact attempt, Briggs said, which means the first communication the family received about the expulsion was a document informing them it was already done. He looked at the legal pad. Walk me through the harassment documentation on the initial incident. Ashworth's composure, which had been shaky since he sat down, developed a new quality of shakiness. There were reports filed. I've read the reports, Briggs said. I want you to walk me through them. What followed was 15 minutes that Emily watched with the quiet attention she'd been applying to rooms all day. Ashworth tried twice to redirect toward the armed incident that morning, and twice Briggs brought him back to the sequence. The harassment reports filed by Garrett Mace's dormitory staff in October, the response categorized as handled in November, the recurrence in December, the December report filed by a different staff member that had been marked under review and then not reviewed, the January escalation, the fight in February, and the expulsion letter sent without a disciplinary hearing, without a parent conference, without any of the procedural steps that the Academy's own handbook specified as mandatory. The room was very quiet by the end of it. Okafor was looking at the table. Weston had stopped writing and was just listening. Ashworth said, We followed the spirit of the protocol. The spirit, Briggs repeated. It's a high volume. Superintendent. Harlow's voice was exactly the same temperature it had been since she walked in that morning. The student whose father drove 9 hours because the school wouldn't return calls was being failed by this institution before the father ever got in his truck. She paused. That is a fact. I would like you to acknowledge it as a fact before we discuss next steps. Ashworth looked at his hands. Something moved across his face that was not entirely calculation, some genuine piece of it, the specific expression of a person recognizing that they are responsible for a chain of events they didn't fully track while they were in the middle of them. Yes, he said. We failed that student. Emily hadn't said anything for most of the debrief. She'd been watching and letting it run and noting where things landed, which was something she'd learned early. The longer you stayed quiet in a room like this, the more useful information you collected before you had to open your mouth. Briggs turned to her. Foster, I want to document your role in the resolution of the incident. The incident resolution is in Weston's report, she said. I want your account. She gave it, flat, sequential, without the texture she'd actually experienced it with. The initial grab, the movement to the office, the management of the environment, the cadet medical crisis, the re-entry, Mace's voluntary surrender of the weapon prior to tactical entry. She did not include Okafor's call, the unauthorized tactical movement, or the call sign broadcast. She included the fact that the tactical entry had been held, without specifying by whose authority. Briggs wrote, Why did you go back in? He asked. After treating the cadet, you had an exit. The situation wasn't resolved, she said. You were a civilian employee in a hostage situation. You had no obligation. The situation wasn't resolved, she said again. Identical words, identical tone. The kind of repeat that was not rudeness, but was the complete answer, and she wasn't going to add decorative language to make it sound like more. Briggs looked at her. He wrote something. Harlow said, I want the full record of this morning's incident formally attached to Foster's service documentation. She said it to the aide who'd been sitting against the wall with a tablet. Including the medical response to the cadet, Full account. Which service documentation? The aide asked. He meant it as a clarifying question, and it landed as one. But the question carried the implication in the room that there were two files. The civilian employment record that said school nurse, Iron Ridge Military Academy, and the other one. Both, Harlow said. Emily looked at her. Harlow met her eyes. The academy has a school nurse, she said. Iron Ridge and everyone in it benefit from that. She paused. The service record reflects what this morning actually demonstrated. She didn't look away. Those are not incompatible facts, Foster. Emily didn't respond immediately. She was aware that this was the moment she was supposed to feel something cinematically significant, vindication or its close relative, or the specific relief of being seen after a long time of not being. She was aware of it as a category of thing that happened to people. What she actually felt was tired. Tired in the way that came after 2 hours of sustained high function, the body's invoice for running the machine at that output. She felt the chair under her. She felt the slightly bad air of the conference room. She felt, somewhere underneath the tired, something smaller and less filmable, a loosening, like something she'd held at a specific tension for a long time had been allowed to ease slightly. She said, Garrett Mace's expulsion. The room adjusted. Everyone at the table who'd been on the military track of the conversation shifted to the school track. Ashworth looked up. The process was defective, Emily said. The documentation on the harassment that preceded the fight is on record. The mandatory hearing didn't happen. The parent notification protocol wasn't followed. She looked at Ashworth directly. What's the reinstatement process? Ashworth opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Briggs. There isn't one in the current handbook, Briggs said, which is itself a documentation gap. Then create one, Emily said, starting now, starting with this case. The academy would need to review. Superintendent. Her voice didn't change volume. A student spent months trying to survive harassment in your dormitory, retaliated once after your school failed to address it, and was removed without a hearing, without his parent being reached, without any of the procedural protections your own handbook promises. She paused. His father just spent 2 hours in a county holding facility because your institution's failure to return phone calls compounded every other failure in this chain. She looked at Ashworth steadily. Review on your own time. What is Garrett Mace's status at this institution as of today? Ashworth held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Briggs again, with the expression of a man who was checking whether the lawyer was going to save him from the room, and the lawyer's expression clearly indicated that the lawyer was not. Under review, Ashworth said. Pending a formal hearing that will be scheduled within 2 weeks, Briggs said. It wasn't a suggestion. 2 weeks, Ashworth said. Emily sat back. Under the table, her right hand had been pressed flat against her thigh for approximately 15 minutes and was leaving a mark she'd notice later. She released it. The conference room cleared in stages. Weston and his sergeant left first. They had processing to finish and a department that needed a debrief of its own. Briggs gathered his legal pad and made 2 calls from the hallway. Ashworth stayed in his seat looking at the table with the specific vacancy of a man processing the scope of the day. Emily was gathering her folder. She'd brought notes, handwritten, which was a habit she'd never dropped, when Okafor appeared at her shoulder. Walk outside, he said. They went through the east wing and into the courtyard, which was empty now. The cold had the particular quality of late Montana March. Thin sun, wind that hadn't made up its mind. Emily stood in the spot where Marcus Webb had gone down at 9:47 that morning and looked at the sky. Harlow, she said. She's not wrong, Okafor said. About the files. She used my call sign on a school intercom. She did, and she's not going to do it again. He paused. She respects what you did this morning. She has a complicated way of showing it. Emily thought about Harlow's face when she said both. The aide's question, the general's answer. The specific 2 syllables that meant the sealed record and the school nurse record were no longer required to pretend the other didn't exist. The call sign broadcast, she said. Is Harlow going to catch anything for that? Informally, Okafor's voice had the quality of someone choosing a word precisely. Harlow's decisions are reviewed at a level I don't have visibility into. But the state police liaison filed his account of the tactical hold, which notes that the entry was paused on Okafor's instruction and then overridden by a general officer. He paused. The fact that the overriding order coincided with the call sign broadcast will not be lost on people who read reports carefully. Emily nodded. She understood what that meant. Not accountability in the immediate or dramatic sense, but the kind of formal record that followed a decision-maker's file the way a shadow followed a person at noon. "Reyes," she said. "Yes." Harlow was on the oversight committee. "Yes." The board that concluded my call was tactically sound. "Yes." Okafor was quiet for a moment. She lobbied for that conclusion, more strongly than the record shows. I thought you should know that. Emily processed this standing in an empty courtyard in Blackstone, Montana, in the thin March sun. It was the kind of information that would have meant something different to her at a different point in the last 6 years. Right now it meant something she didn't have a clean word for. Not forgiveness, not release, something more structural. A fact that had been in the wrong configuration for 6 years and had just been moved. "Garrett Mace," she said. "Reinstatement hearing in 2 weeks," Okafor said. "Briggs will ensure the process runs correctly. The harassment documentation makes this straightforward once the hearing actually happens." "And Dale?" "His attorney, he'll have one within the week, will have access to the full account of this morning, including your statement about the voluntary weapon surrender and the context of the father's state when he arrived." Okafor paused. "That doesn't undo the charges, but it shapes how they're presented." She nodded. The cold was working through her cardigan, which she'd been wearing since 7:45 that morning and had stopped thinking about hours ago. She was aware she hadn't eaten since 6 a.m. She was aware her legs were doing the specific thing legs did after a sustained adrenaline event, which was arguing with her about continuing to function. She turned to go back inside. "Foster." She stopped. "What you built in that clinic," Okafor said. "The map on the wall, the supply cabinet, the secondary O2. He paused. "None of that was in your job description." "No," she said. "You were preparing anyway." "Old habit," she said. He looked at her. James Okafor, who had known her since she was 22 and a field medic with a call sign she hadn't earned yet, looked at her with the specific expression of someone who is choosing not to say the larger thing because the smaller thing is more honest. "You never stopped," he said, "even when you thought you had." She looked at him. Then she turned and walked back toward the east wing doors, and she was 3 steps from the door when her phone buzzed. She pulled it out. Unknown number, Montana area code. She answered. "This is Emily Foster." A pause. Then a young voice, male, controlled in the way of someone who had practiced control because they'd needed to learn it early. "This is Garrett Mace," he said. "I got your number from the nurse's office contact sheet. I hope I'm sorry if that's not—" "It's fine," she said. "I told you to make contact." "Right." A pause. "I just wanted to— I called my dad. The county jail number. They let me through." Another pause. He picked up. She stood at the east wing door with her hand on the handle. "He said some things," Garrett said, about what you did. In there. His voice had the particular quality of someone managing a lot at once and not entirely succeeding. "I just wanted to say, I don't know how to—" "You don't have to," Emily said. "I know, but I wanted to." She stood there for a moment. The cold was coming off the door handle. "Garrett," she said, "the hearing in 2 weeks. Tell your story exactly the way it happened. The October reports, the December escalation, all of it. Don't simplify it." She paused. "They need to hear the whole thing." "I will," he said. She said goodbye and hung up. She pushed through the east wing door. Inside, the hallway had the specific recovered quality of a building that had been through something and was trying to resume. Voices, footsteps, the distant administrative machinery of a school in the late afternoon. She walked back toward the clinic, past Hale's office, The door was open, the gun was gone. The desk was back to its usual geography, except for the two chairs still positioned facing each other in the center of the room. Past Sandra's desk, where Sandra was back in her chair, looking at her computer screen with the expression of someone deciding which of the 47 pending items was the most urgent. Sandra looked up when Emily passed. She opened her mouth, closed it, said, "You should have told us." Emily stopped. Sandra was looking at her with something complicated in her face. Not quite apology, not quite accusation, the specific expression of a person who has been asked to revise their understanding of someone they thought they knew. "Told you what?" Emily said. "Who you were." Emily looked at her for a moment, thought about 2 years of potlucks and hallway pleasantries and the evacuation map nobody had asked about, thought about what it would have changed. "I'm the school nurse," she said. "That was always accurate." She went into the clinic and closed the door. She sat in her chair. The desk was exactly as she'd left it at 8:47 that morning. Intake log open, pen beside it, the entry half finished. She picked up the pen, set it down. She looked at the evacuation map on the wall, the red lines she'd added in November, the notations in her own handwriting marking the exits and the bottlenecks and the East Quad entrance she'd used this morning. She thought about Okafor saying you never stopped. She thought about Marcus Webb at 81% blood oxygen. About Mace's hands when he'd finally set the gun down on the desk. About 7 cadets standing in a row in an empty courtyard because Dessa Park had decided it was the right thing and gone ahead and done it. She thought about Garrett Mace on the phone, saying he picked up. She was still sitting there, not quite doing anything, when there was a knock on the clinic door. She looked up. "Come in," she said. The door opened. It was Harlow, without the aide, without Briggs. Just the general, standing in the doorway of a school nurse's clinic in a cardigan-decorated office that smelled like antiseptic and carpet, looking at Emily Foster with an expression that had finally dropped the operational neutral it had worn all day. She held a folder. "There's something in your service file," Harlow said. "Something that didn't make it into the sealed record because the officer who filed it used the wrong classification code and it went into a routing error for 6 years." She paused. "I found it 3 months ago." Emily looked at the folder. "It's Reyes," Harlow said. "There's a field report from the combat surgeon at the evacuation point, submitted 48 hours after the incident." Emily's hands were very still on the desk. "He documented what he found when the team brought Reyes in," Harlow said. "The improvised wound management, the field decisions." She paused. "His conclusion was that Reyes survived the initial injury by roughly 40 minutes longer than he should have given the circumstances, because of interventions made at the field position." She looked at Emily directly. "Your interventions." The clinic was very quiet. "He didn't make it," Emily said. Her voice was level. "No," Harlow said. "But not for the reasons you've been carrying." She set the folder on the desk. "The field report documents that the injury Reyes sustained was non-survivable from the point of impact, not from the decision to move, not from the extraction, from the moment it happened." She paused. "You kept him alive long enough for him to get to the surgeon. The surgeon put it in writing." Emily looked at the folder on her desk. She did not open it. 6 years, she said. "Yes," Harlow said. "I'm sorry." The word sat in the room. An unusual word from Harlow, and it landed with unusual weight because it clearly cost her something to say it. Emily looked at the folder, at her name on the tab, at the classification stamp and the routing error notation and all the bureaucratic machinery of a document that had been filed wrong in 2019 and found in 2025, and was sitting on a school nurse's desk in Montana in March, while outside cadets were walking to dinner and a man was sitting in a county jail and a 17-year-old boy had called his father and the call had gone through. She reached out and opened the folder. The field report was 11 pages. Emily read all of them. Harlow stood in the doorway of the clinic and did not speak, which Emily appreciated more than she would have been able to say. The general had the rare quality of knowing when a room needed to be left alone, even when she was in it. The combat surgeon's name was Dr. Felix Oduya. She hadn't known him personally. He'd been at the evacuation point, not in the field, and by the time Emily had reached that location, she'd been dealing with 3 other casualties and the specific administrative chaos that followed an operation that had gone sideways. She'd never read his report. She hadn't known it existed. He wrote clinically, the way surgeons wrote, without the decorative language that crept into documents when people were trying to soften what they were saying. He described the entry wound, the trajectory, the organ damage that was present when Reyes arrived at the evacuation point. He described, with the same clinical precision, the field interventions he'd found evidence of, the packing, the tourniquet placement, the airway management done with materials that were not in any standard kit. In the final paragraph he wrote, "The interventions documented above reflect a level of field medicine that is not consistent with standard training. They are consistent with someone making correct decisions under sustained pressure with inadequate resources. These interventions extended the patient's viable window by an estimated 35 to 45 minutes. The injury itself was non-survivable. That fact exists independent of any decision made at the field position." The last line, "I am submitting this report because the record should reflect what actually happened, not what is easiest to conclude." Emily closed the folder. She sat with it closed for a moment. Her hands were on this cover. 6 years. She'd spent 6 years in the specific kind of guilt that didn't announce itself loudly, not the consuming, visible kind, but the quiet, structural kind that organized everything around itself without you noticing. The kind that makes you choose a town in Montana because it's far. The kind that makes you put a red-marked evacuation map on a clinic wall and keep a secondary O2 canister in a supply room nobody asks about because you can't stop preparing for the thing you think you failed to prevent. Dr. Felix Oduya, combat surgeon, had written the truth in 2019 and put it in a routing envelope, and a classification error had swallowed it for 6 years. Nobody had lied. Nobody had buried it deliberately. It had just disappeared into the machinery, the way things did, and the machinery hadn't cared what it cost her. That was almost harder than malice would have been. Malice had a shape you could push against. She looked up at Harlow. "The officer who filed it wrong," she said. "Retired," Harlow said. "Not as a result of this. Routine." "And the routing error?" "Corrected. The report is now properly filed and attached to your service record." Harlow paused. "Both of them?" Emily nodded. She looked at the folder again, then she set it in her desk drawer and closed the drawer and stood up. "Okay," she said. Harlow looked at her. "That's it? What else is there?" "Most people would have more to say." "I'm sure I will," Emily said. "Later. Right now there's a dinner service happening in this school, and I should check whether Marcus Webb has been cleared to eat normally or needs a modified intake after the morning he had." Harlow stared at her for a moment. Then something crossed her face that was the closest thing to a smile Emily had seen on her all day. "You're something else, Foster," she said. "People keep saying that today," Emily said, and went to find Marcus Webb. The formal public statement came 4 days later. Emily had not been consulted on the timing, which she would have preferred, but she'd been consulted on the content, which mattered more. Okafor had sent her the draft at 11 p.m. on the second day, and she'd sent back 3 corrections, and he'd incorporated all of them without comment, which was how their collaboration had always worked. The statement was issued jointly by the Department of Defense and the Iron Ridge Military Academy Board of Directors. It was read publicly at a press briefing held at the Blackstone County Community Center, which was the largest indoor public space available on short notice, and was at capacity with reporters, Academy families, Blackstone locals, and the specific category of interested observer that materializes whenever something happened in a small town that turned out to be larger than anyone expected. Emily was not at the briefing. She was in her clinic because it was a Tuesday and she had 7 intake appointments and Marcus Webb needed his post-episode follow-up charted and signed before the end of the week. She read the statement afterward on her phone while eating a sandwich at her desk. The statement acknowledged Emily Foster's military service record, described as distinguished and extensive in language that was accurate without being specific, which was the compromise she'd agreed to. It described the events of the previous Tuesday, neutrally, sequentially, without heroic inflation, and noted that her actions during the incident had prevented injury and facilitated a peaceful resolution. It noted the medical response to the cadet respiratory crisis. It noted the voluntary surrender of the weapon before the tactical entry. The final paragraph addressed the DOJ findings, regarding Iron Ridge Military Academy's disciplinary protocols. It stated that the Academy's handling of the harassment reports preceding Cadet Garrett Mace's expulsion had been procedurally deficient and that a comprehensive review of the institution's student protection policies would be conducted under federal oversight. It stated that the expulsion was under active review by an independent hearing panel. It stated that the Academy's superintendent had submitted a formal letter of accountability to the board. It did not say that Gerald Ashworth had submitted his resignation the same morning, which Emily learned from Okafor separately, and which she filed without comment. It did not say that Brigadier General Harlow had been formally counseled for the unauthorized call sign broadcast and tactical override, which was in a separate internal document that Emily would never see but that Okafor had confirmed existed. Those consequences were real, and they were documented, and they would follow the people they belonged to. They just wouldn't be publicized, because institutional accountability rarely was. Emily had been in enough rooms to know that the public version and the actual version were always different documents. What mattered was that the actual version existed. She finished her sandwich. She charted Marcus Webb's follow-up. She moved on to the next appointment. The hearing for Garrett Mace happened 12 days later, not 14, because Briggs had applied the specific pressure available to a DOJ attorney with an active federal oversight file, and the Academy's new acting superintendent had decided that moving faster was in everyone's interest. Emily was asked to provide a written statement. She gave it, factual, specific, covering the conversation with Dale Mace in the office and what he'd communicated about the sequence of events from the family's perspective. She included the timeline of communication failures. She kept it to 2 pages. She was not present at the hearing itself. She learned the outcome from Dessa Park, who appeared in the clinic doorway at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon, still in her academy uniform, with the officer's stripe on her shoulder and a look of barely controlled satisfaction on her face. "He's back," she said. "Effective next Monday. Full reinstatement, no probation period, harassment documentation expunged from his disciplinary record." Emily looked up from her desk. "The other cadet, the one who initiated the harassment." Dessa's expression shifted. "Separate hearing next week. For him." A pause. "The October and December reports were re-reviewed. It's not looking good for him." "It shouldn't," Emily said. "Not with heat, just as a fact about logical consequences." Dessa stood in the doorway for a moment. She had the look of someone who wanted to say something more than the update and was working out how to say it. "The salute," Emily said. "In the courtyard." Dessa looked at her. "Yeah. That was your call. Marcus couldn't stand up yet and someone needed to do something and it seemed—" She stopped. "It seemed right." Emily looked at her. Dessa Park, 16, junior officer stripe, who had held an albuterol canister steady for a boy she barely knew, and then organized 6 cadets into a row in an empty courtyard because it seemed right. "It was right," Emily said. Dessa nodded once. Then she turned and walked back down the hall with the specific gait of a person who has received the only confirmation they needed and doesn't require anything else. Dale Mace's case moved through the Blackstone County court system over the following 2 months, with the imperfect, grinding pace of actual legal process, not the television version, where things resolved cleanly in 45 minutes, but the real version, with continuances and paperwork and a public defender who was competent but overworked and a DA who had a public record to manage. He pleaded guilty to criminal menacing and unlawful restraint. The possession charge was reduced. His attorney, and Emily had provided her written account to that attorney, including the voluntary weapon surrender and the context of the communication failures that preceded the incident, presented the mitigating factors clearly and without theater. The judge sentenced him to time served, 90 days of supervised release, mandatory mental health assessment and counseling, and community service. No prison term. No permanent weapons prohibition pending the assessment outcomes. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't erasure. It was what happened when a man who made a catastrophic decision in a parking lot had the context of that decision fully presented to the people who were deciding what it meant. Emily read the sentencing summary the evening it came through. She noted the counseling requirement and thought it was the most useful part of the outcome and hoped he'd actually engage with it rather than perform it. She thought about the undercooked eggs, about a 17-year-old handing his late father a plate of scrambled eggs, and saying you're late and meaning something entirely different from the words. About the specific ways people tried to reach each other across the distances they'd never fully mapped. She hoped Dale Mace would learn a better language. She thought he might. People who'd already been to their worst and survived it sometimes did. Okafor came back to Blackstone in May. Not on official business, or not entirely, which was the most honest way to describe it. He came on a Tuesday, drove up from the airport in a rental car that was slightly too small for him, and appeared in the clinic doorway at 11 a.m. while Emily was restocking the supply cabinet. "You could have called," she said. "I was in the region," he said. "Technically. The nearest base is 4 hours away. I drive fast." She let him in. He sat in the chair across from her desk that had been occupied by a succession of people in the last 2 months. Students with stomach aches, a junior instructor with a stress fracture he'd been ignoring, Dessa Park 3 times on various pretexts that all turned out to be the same pretext, which was that she'd decided Emily was someone worth talking to, and she'd acted on that decision with the same directness she applied to everything else. Okafor looked at the evacuation map on the wall, the red marker notations that were still there, because Emily had redrawn them after the incident to account for the tactical entry point she hadn't originally marked. "You updated it," he said. "New data," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Harlow's being reassigned," he said, "not as a consequence. It was already scheduled. She'll be heading the Northern Regional Medical Preparedness Division starting in August." Emily looked at him. "Medical preparedness," she said. "Yes." A pause. "She requested the assignment." Emily thought about that. About a general who'd spent her career in command roles requesting a medical preparedness division at the end of it. About a board that had lobbied for a conclusion that said tactically sound and then filed the finding where it would be most useful. About the ways people tried to do right by things they'd gotten wrong, and how those attempts were imperfect and came late and were still worth something. "Reyes family," she said. "I've been in contact," Okafor said. "I thought that was something you'd want to know rather than something you'd want to do yourself. At least not yet." "Yes, Sass," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. She looked at the supply cabinet, which was fully restocked now and didn't need any more of her attention. She turned back to Okafor. "Why did you actually come?" she said. He looked at her directly. James Okafor, who had known her for 9 years and communicated in the stripped-down language of people who'd worked in high-stakes environments long enough to stop bothering with the surrounding material. "Harlow's division is going to need a trauma medicine advisor," he said. "Someone who understands field conditions and institutional medicine and the gap between them." He paused. "Someone who's been living in that gap for 2 years and has strong opinions about what fills it." Emily looked at him. "That's not a desk job," he said. "It's not combat. It's building something. Protocols, training, the kind of work that doesn't show up until it's needed and then matters enormously." He paused. "You'd be good at it." She thought about the secondary O2 canister, the red marker map, the medication bag she'd built over 2 years because she couldn't stop preparing even when she thought she'd walked away from everything that made preparation necessary. She thought about Marcus Webb at 81% oxygen, about what it meant that she'd been there, and ready, and able. "I'm the school nurse," she said. "You're the school nurse," Okafor agreed. "And Iron Ridge is lucky to have you." "That's not what I'm questioning." He paused. "I'm asking if that's everything." The clinic was quiet. Outside, the May version of Blackstone was happening. Marginally warmer, the mountains still white above the tree line, the flagpole in front of the academy casting its late morning shadow across the quad where 7 cadets had stood in a row and held a salute for someone they barely knew, because it seemed right. Emily thought about what it meant to stop. To choose a town because it was far and then spend 2 years building something in it that you'd have sworn you were done building. To carry a weight for 6 years and discover that the weight had been the wrong shape all along. Not that it was gone, not that it lifted cleanly, but that the thing you'd been carrying had always been different from the thing you thought it was. She thought about Specialist Reyes, whose name she said to herself every morning, not as a ritual of punishment, but because she'd decided a long time ago that forgetting would be a worse option than remembering. She thought about 35 to 40 minutes, about what Dr. Felix Oduya had put in writing and what that meant, not as absolution. She didn't need absolution, she needed accuracy, but as a correction to a record that had been wrong for too long. She thought about what Okafor had said in March. You never stopped. Tell me about the position, she said. He told her. She listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting, tracking the parts that would matter against the parts that were context. She asked 3 questions. He answered all of them without inflation. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. I'd want to stay on contract with Iron Ridge, she said. Part-time. They need someone who actually knows what they're doing in this clinic. That can be arranged. And I'd want Dessa Park flagged, she said, for the Academy's medical officer track. She has the instincts, and she's going to need somewhere to put them. Okafor looked at her. Dessa Park, he said, like he was noting the name. Cadet Lieutenant. 16. She organized the courtyard salute. Emily paused. She also held a bronchodilator valve steady under pressure and retained every instruction I gave her on the first pass. She didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She just did what needed doing. I'll flag it, he said. She nodded. She looked at the evacuation map one more time, at the red lines she'd drawn and redrawn, at the notations in her own handwriting that nobody had asked about for 2 years and 4 months, until the morning they'd become relevant. She thought, this was always the job, not the cardigan and the ibuprofen bin and the potluck she stood at the edge of. The other thing, the thing underneath, the thing that didn't stop just because she'd decided to point it somewhere quieter. She thought, the quieter direction hadn't been wrong. It had been exactly what it needed to be for exactly as long as it needed to be, and now it was something else's turn. She pulled open her desk drawer, took out a notepad, wrote down 3 things she'd need to follow up on before she could say yes. Supply succession for the clinic, timing on the transition, the contract language for the part-time arrangement, and set the pen down. She looked at Okafor. I'll need 2 weeks to hand the clinic off properly, she said. He said, take 3. She almost smiled. 2 is fine. He stood up. The rental car that was too small for him was in the faculty lot, and he had a flight to catch from an airport 4 hours away. He moved toward the door with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had a schedule but managed it rather than being managed by it. He stopped in the doorway. For what it's worth, he said. The people in that gymnasium on Tuesday, the students, the staff, 43 people who went home that evening. He paused. They went home because you were in a school in Montana that you picked because it was far from everything. She looked at him. That's not the lesson I'd take from it, she said. What's the lesson? She thought about it honestly. Not the version that sounded correct, but the version that was accurate, that she'd been turning over since she sat in that chair across from Dale Mace and watched him become a person instead of a situation. That you don't get to decide when you're done, she said. You just get to decide what you do with it. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked out. She listened to his footsteps down the hall. She listened to the east wing door open and close. She sat in the clinic that smelled like antiseptic and old carpet, with an evacuation map on the wall and a folder in her desk drawer and a notepad with 3 items on it, and she let the quiet be what it was. Not emptiness, not absence, but the particular quality of a room that has held something significant and is now holding the space where the next thing will be. Outside, a morning formation was crossing the quad. She could hear the cadence call faintly through the window. A junior instructor's voice, even and rhythmic, the sound of a school resuming its ordinary work. In 3 minutes, she had an appointment with a sophomore who'd sprained his wrist in PT and hadn't told anyone for 4 days. She'd seen the way he'd been favoring his left side in the corridor and had scheduled him herself. She picked up her pen. She wrote the 4th item on the notepad. Then she went to work. There's a specific thing that happens to people who carry their capability quietly for a long time, who do what needs doing without waiting to be asked, who prepare without being praised for preparing, who hold the line in rooms nobody is watching. The world tends to organize itself around louder evidence, around the people who announce what they're doing while they're doing it, but rooms get locked down. Patients stop breathing. The ordinary morning turns into the hour that sorts out everything you actually are, And the people who've been quietly ready are the ones already moving. Emily Foster drove to work the next morning with the same dark circles she'd always had, and the same unwillingness to explain herself, and a folder in her bag that she'd decide what to do with on her own timeline. She was not transformed. She was not healed in the clean, cinematic sense. She was the same person she'd been on Monday, except that a few things that had been in the wrong configuration were now in the right one. That's usually how it works. Not a single moment of blinding clarity. Just the slow, stubborn accumulation of choosing to keep going. And then one Tuesday, when it matters, you're already there. You were always already there.